Hi, this is Cinnamon with Liberty Jane, and today we're going to take a closer look at the latest piece in the Tokyo Libby collection. This new coat design can double as a coat or simply as a coat dress. Buttons all the way up the front, has princess seams, and a really cute back inset detail where you can use lace or other trims for a ruffled effect. Here we have our fabrics selected for this coat. We have this polyester blend lining, which is a really cute print that brings out the teal. And then we have this really beautiful wool fabric that we picked up on a trip to San Francisco when we visited Britex Fabrics. And then we have black velveteen for the trims on the cuffs and the edge of the cape. So to start with, I have all the pattern pieces printed out as well as the summary of instructions. Here we have the pattern pieces cut out. You'll notice that I have three piles. I have this side over here, which is just the jacket fabric, the fashion fabric, or the outside fabric. Then I have this pile in the middle, which is fabric and lining using the same pattern piece. And then over here we have a few pieces that are cut out just of the lining fabric. So pay special attention to that on the pattern pieces themselves. You'll notice that they have writing that says cut 2 of fabric, cut 2 of lining, or cut 1 on fold of fabric, cut 1 of lining, that type of phrasing. So just pay special attention to that. The other thing that you'll want to notice is which pattern pieces need to be cut on a fold. So you can see that marking right here. These arrows that come to the side show that this side needs to be on the fold of the fabric. Then you also just want to be sure that you pay attention to the grain line markings on each piece and make sure that they're following the grain of the fabric. Pin your pattern pieces to the fabric, being sure that your fabric is folded for double thickness and you're pinning through both layers. Pin around the edge of each pattern piece just along the seam allowance line is a good place to have your pins, being sure that your pin head and the pin end are not extending past the edge of the pattern piece anywhere. So you just go ahead and pin all your pieces, and also be sure that you have your pattern pieces that need to be on a fold lined up right along the edge of the folded fabric. Now, one other thing you notice on here are the notch markings. There's several along the coat front and the sleeves. So these little dashed lines right here are to notch the fabric, and you can either cut a little triangle that extends out at that area, or you can just snip right into the seam allowance just a tiny bit to mark those spots. Here we have an example of the notches. You can see on this one right here, I've notched outward. And on this one right here, I've just cut a small slit right here into the pattern. And it's into the seam allowance, but it doesn't cross the seam allowance stitching line. Another thing that I like to mark that way is center front and then these fold lines that will come up later in the pattern. So I've just cut a small slit right here, and right here on both the top and on the bottom. And that way when it comes time to fold back these pieces or stitch along these lines, it'll make it easy to make sure that I have it consistent at the top and the bottom and it lines up exactly with the pattern. One other notch marking that I'll mention is for the sleeve and the coat back. So you'll notice here we have notch markings on the front, up at the top, and for the back. The back has two lines together, which is where you would cut a larger notch. And that lines up with the coat side back. There's two markings on the side back, and then just a single marking for the side front. So I'll just make sure that I have either a small notch on the front and a large notch for the back, or I'll just cut an outward notch for the back to match up with the side back, and then on the front side I would just cut a little slit here to line up with the notch on the front of the coat. And then up here, this one right here is a notch that you'll cut. You cut this little slit and it will line up with your shoulder seam so that your sleeve is set in properly. Here we have all the pattern pieces cut out. We have the side front, the side back, the cape back, the cape front, the sleeve, the lower center back, the upper center back. We have the cape border, we have the collar, and we have center front and center front lining, which are two different pattern pieces. To start sewing the pattern, we're going to start with the back of the coat. This is the lower center back and the upper center back, and then these are the two side back pieces, just separated and set so you can see how that will lay out once it's sewn together. So to start with, we're going to start with the center lower back piece and set these three pieces aside. We have our 5 pieces of 1-inch lace cut at 10 inches, 8 inches, 7 inches, 6 inches, and 4 inches. Now we're going to sew a basting stitch along the top edge of each piece of lace, 1/8 of an inch down. And a basting stitch is the largest straight stitch on your sewing machine. On the machine I have, it's number 5. And you want to make sure that you don't back stitch at the front or the back, and that you have both the upper thread and the bobbin thread extending out on both sides. So you'll repeat this for all 5 layers. Once you have all your gathering stitches sewn in your pieces of lace, you'll start with the longest one, and you'll have your center lower back right side up, and the lace is right side up. And you're going to lay this 1/4 inch above the bottom edge so that there's room to sew the hem. And you'll pin one side down, and then you'll gather this piece of lace to fit straight across. Pull the basting threads to line up both ends to match up with the edges of the piece for the center back of the jacket. And then once you have your basting threads pulled, you can evenly space out the lace so that it's evenly gathered across here, and then we'll stitch this down. Once you've stitched down the first ruffle, you'll take your second longest length. This is the 8-inch piece, and then you're going to place it on the center back so that it just covers the first row of stitching line. And here it's white so that you can clearly see it, but if you're making this jacket, you'd want the stitching to be the same color as the lace so it doesn't show. Here we have this second row of lace ruffle pinned down, and now we've straight stitched to secure the second row on top of the first. Now we'll just repeat the process for the other 3 layers. Now that you have all 5 lace ruffles sewn onto the center lower back, we're going to take the center upper back with right side up like this, so we have the upper and the lower. We're going to flip this over so right sides are together. Line up this center back seam, pin it, and then straight stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance along this seam line. Now that we have the seam sewn, we will fold the upper back up, and the seam allowance of all 3 pieces will fold up towards the top. So this goes this way, and the seam allowance is pressed up. We've pressed this seam carefully, and you want to be extra careful with the lace so that it doesn't melt to lay some fabric over the lace as you press this seam. Now we have a piece of 3/8 inch wide velvet ribbon that we're going to lay over this seam, just like this to cover it, and then at the end we'll have a bow that hangs from right here over all the ruffles. So for this we will just baste on either side right here to secure it in place. Now we take the side back and sew it to the center back. The side back has the notch that we clipped right here, and this is lining up with this seam that we sewed right here. So as we pin it in, we might want to start right here and then work our way down to the top and the bottom to make sure that the piece is pinned on exactly right. Here we have the side back piece pinned all the way along this seam, and you'll notice that the shoulders are lined up and we have the hemline lined up. Now that we have this seam sewn, we're going to carefully cut a small slit into the seam allowance just above this waistline seam. Once we've made that slit into the seam allowance, it allows us to press open the seam allowance above the waistline, and then below the waistline it's pressed towards the side. And this is what it looks like at this point from the right side. Repeat that whole process for the other side back. Then we're going to set this aside and work on the jacket front. Here we have the center front and the side front. I'm just showing it to you again with the pattern pieces on top so you're familiar with what pieces they are cut out. Now we're going to take one of each piece, this is right sides up, and we're going to sew this seam. So this seam is going to connect with this side. We're going to line up the waistline seam notch and pin here first. With right sides together, we have the pieces laid on top of each other, and we'll start pinning at the waistline notch. And then that way we'll ensure, same as the back, that it lines up all the way to the shoulder and down to the hemline. Now we have the entire seam pinned, and we'll go ahead and straight stitch along this line at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now the seam has been straight stitched. We're going to take it over to our iron, lay it flat, and press this seam open. Here you can see we have the seam pressed open on the front, and then we've gone ahead and repeated that for the other side front. Here we have our shoulder seams for our 2 front pieces. Now we're going to bring back over our back piece and set it right here so we can line up the shoulder seams. This is right side up right now, and we're going to line up this seam line, the princess seam line, all the way at the shoulder when we flip this over, and we pin this together along this line. So just make sure that you have this seam line lined up. Here we have both shoulder seams sewn, and you can see right here why it's important to make sure that that seam's lined up, because it'll carry over from the front to the back right across the shoulder. Now we're going to set this aside and we will work on the collar. The collar is cut out of the velveteen fabric. So you can see right here we have 2 pieces, and we are going to place them on top of each other, right sides together, and then we'll stitch along the side, the top, and the other side. The bottom section we'll leave open. So on this piece, the bottom is the shorter of the 2 lengths. Now that we've stitched the edges of the collar, we're just going to trim down around this seam line, especially right here at the corners. You'll just take this and clip right along the edge, but be careful not to clip into the stitching, and then you'll just kind of grade it up away from the seam. That'll give you a lot less bulk on this corner when you turn it right side out, so you can have a nice point on the edge of your collar. Then you're going to turn the collar right side out. So you just fold it out like this, and you'll just push the corners out. If you have a little tool like this, this is a point turner. It has a nice pointy end, and you can just put it right in here and carefully just push into this seam until you have the corner turned out. And then you go ahead and do it on the other side. And you just push gently. You don't want to push through the stitching. Then you carefully press this so that the whole collar lays flat. Here we have the coat and the collar, and I've marked center back on the jacket with this pin, and the other areas that we're going to pay attention to are the shoulder seams and then center front, which is where I've clipped earlier. It's the first clip mark on the front piece of the jacket. So on the collar we have a cut notch for center back and each shoulder seam. So we'll start with this center back notch, and we'll line it up with our center back marking with right sides together, and we're going to pin it in this direction. So I'll pin here first, and I'll line up these other notches with shoulder seam, and then the front edge of the collar lines up with center front. Here we have the collar pinned securely in place, and now we're going to straight stitch the collar to the coat. Here we have the sleeve piece and the lace trim that you can put along the bottom edge of the sleeve. So the lace and the 3/8 inch ribbon are both cut about 6 inches wide. So you're just going to take the lace and you're going to set it a 1/4 inch from the bottom. And then you'll take the piece of ribbon and cover the top edge of the seam and straight stitch down along both edges of the ribbon to secure the lace and the ribbon to the bottom edge of the sleeve. Here we've gone ahead and repeated the lace and the trim for the opposite sleeve. Now we're going to set this sleeve aside, and we have this sleeve right here with the notch for the back side of the coat right here. Then here we have the arm's eye of the coat, and you can see on this back part right here is the notch for the back. So we're going to line up the sleeve into this opening, matching up the notch, and then the slit that we have cut for the notch on the front side, and the slit at the top of the sleeve to line up with the shoulder seam. Here we have the arm's eye seam sewn, and you can see it curves just along the top of the sleeve and the arm of the jacket. So you're just going to flip that over, and that's how that seam looks sewn. Then you're just going to go ahead and sew the sleeve to the other side of the coat. Here we have the coat to this point with the sleeves attached, the collar is attached, and now we're going to set it aside and work on the lining. Here we have the lining pieces for the back of the coat. They're the same pieces as the fashion fabric and they go together in the same way. So to start, we're going to sew the center waist seam and then connect the sides to the back. Here we have the back lining pieces all sewn together. And here we have the front lining pieces. This is the side front and this is the center front of one side. And then we have the same pieces for the other side front. So we're going to sew these together and then we're going to continue to sew it together at the shoulder seams and attach the sleeve to the lining. Here we have the inside lining all sewn together, sleeves attached front and back together at the shoulder seams. So this right here is the center front opening. Now if we look at the coat and the lining next to each other, you'll see that they look like a mirror image of each other. So what we're going to do now is sew this center front seam. So we have the jacket and we have the lining, and the lining is a narrower piece and the coat extends a lot farther because once they're sewn together, the fabric for the coat is going to fold to the inside slightly. So we're going to take the lining and set it on top of the coat and sew right along this line at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once we've sewn the center front seam on this side, you'll flip it over to the opposite side, pin, and then straight stitch along the other side of the center front. Once we have the two center fronts sewn, we're going to look into the neck opening of the coat. And we're going to fold back part of the front of the jacket, which is the blue fabric. So you'll notice these notch markings that I pointed out at the beginning. This is the stitching line. This one right here marks the fold line, and then this collar is sewn to the notch that marked center front. So what we're going to do right now is fold right along this notch, and I have it clipped at the top and at the bottom, which makes it easy to line up. So this is going to fold back right there on that notch. Once you fold back on this notch, you'll pin down here, and then you'll continue to pin with the collar pointing down the lining to the coat, and you'll just move along this way, and then just be sure to match up the shoulder seam from the lining with the shoulder seam of the coat on both sides, matching center back. And then when you get over here, it will be the same thing. You'll fold back along this notch so that it overlaps the collar slightly. Now here we have the collar seam sewn, and because it's a round circular seam, we're going to clip into this right up to the stitching line in several places. So you'll just cut little slits into the seam allowance, but be careful not to cut over the stitching line. Do 3 or 4 across the back, and it'll make it turn a lot easier and it'll lay a lot better. Then just trim down this corner right here, right up to the stitching line, so when you turn this it has a clean pointed edge. Then we're going to turn the coat around and work on the bottom hem. So to do this, we're going to pin up this bottom lace ruffle just so that it doesn't get caught in the hemline. So we've pinned that up a few times, and make sure that you're pretty far away from the bottom edge with your pins. Then we're going to take the bottom edge of the back of the lining. This is the right side. So we're going to line that up, matching up the seams. So we have the seam here and the side, and then we're going to pin and stitch along this side. Once we've stitched the back hemline, you'll turn the coat around to the front, fold the center front back at the notch, and then pin along the hemline, being sure to match up this front princess seam. Once we've sewn the bottom of the front hemline, you'll turn the coat and then you'll sew the hemline of the sleeve. And you can do the same thing. Carefully fold the lace out of the way and then line up the lining and the sleeve at the hemline and straight stitch right along this edge. Now we're going to do the side seams of the jacket. So this technique is a little bit hard to communicate through the pattern, which is why this video is great. To do this, you are going to open up the sleeve and push the front of the jacket back through to the inside, and we're going to line up the side seam. So to do this, you're basically folding the coat inside out. So you'll line up the side seam for the coat. This is the underarm seam right here, and I'm just going to pin that in place. And then we'll come down here, and you can see this is the ribbon that we sewed and the lace that we sewed at the base of the sleeve. So we'll just make sure those are lined up and pin that right there. Then we'll just continue down around the sleeve to the lining. Make sure you have the hemline matched up. So here we have the underarm of the lining, and I'm just going to match up this seam right here. So this right here is the sleeve. Now the rest of the jacket is just pushed to the inside. So this is the side seam of the lining. It's the front to the back. And then down here we have the hem of the coat, front to back. So just make sure that that is lined up. And then this right here is the side seam of the coat, the front lined up with the back. So once you have this pinned like this, you basically have a big loop. So you can just start at the inside on the lining and just start sewing, and you sew all the way around in a circle, and then just back stitch on this side. For the opposite side of the jacket, you're going to do the same thing, but you'll need to leave a portion of the lining on the side, like from this pin to this pin. This is probably about 2.5 inches, not sewn, so that you have a hole right here, and that's how you'll turn the whole jacket right side out. Here we have both side seams sewn, so we have a loop on this side and the loop on this side. So this is the coat part, the lining part. This one's sewn all the way around, and then on this side it's the coat part and the lining part, and we left it open right here. So what we're going to do is turn the entire coat right side out through this hole. So you carefully push this through the opening, and the whole coat will push out, and you'll have your hemline sewn. So here's the inside. Then you carefully push the sleeve all the way out so that it's inside and it pops out, and then your hemline is already sewn. Then we'll take a tool like a point turner, which has a pointy tip, but it's not sharp, so it won't poke through the fabric. So you'll carefully go in through this side hole, and you'll just go and push out all the corners. So this is the center front, and just use that to carefully push that out. And then down at the bottom by the hem, you'll have the same type of corner. So just kind of push that along the seam to get a nice corner edge, and then reach all the way through the other side, and you'll do the same thing with the other corners. And once you have those smoothed out, then you'll go ahead and press the coat. Here we have the coat pressed, and you can see that all the edges are pressed nice and square. And then as we've gone around and pressed the hem, we're just sure that the fabric for the coat is a little bit more turned under than the lining, so that from the front side all you see is the coat and the lining doesn't extend past the coat edge. So once you've pressed the coat, you can go ahead and hand sew this opening closed. Just turn the edges to the inside and then just hand stitch that shut. Now we're going to move on to the buttons and the buttonholes. So to do the buttonholes for the front, I'm going to put the buttonholes on the wearer's right side of the coat. To mark those, I'm just going to take my pattern piece, which has these markings right here for the buttons, and I'm going to use those to mark where the buttonholes will go on the coat. So I'm just going to fold this back along this dashed center front line, and then I'm going to line that up with my collar point and the bottom of the coat at center front, which is about 1/4 inch in from the edge. And then you can see where I have each of these little circles, and I'm just going to take my pencil. I have a white marking pencil that I can just make a little white dash on here, and then I'll know where to put my buttonholes. So I'm just going to mark this. And then I have a very faint marking along the front edge of the coat. And then I'll use those with my buttonhole foot on my machine to sew each buttonhole. Here we have the completed buttonhole sewn by machine. Now I'm just going to show you a technique I use to open the buttonhole. So if you put a pin right in the end before the back and forth stitching line on the end of your buttonhole, and then you take your seam ripper and you poke it right into the fabric between the 2 rows of stitching, and you just push up, it'll tear the fabric open, but it gets stopped right here at the pin, so it can't go any farther and it can't rip through the end of the buttonhole. So you'll do that, and then you'll put a pin in the other end to go back in the other direction, and then just repeat that for all 6 buttonholes. Now once you have your buttonholes open, just overlap your center front, and then I would take the same marking pencil and just mark it inside each hole where the button will go, like that, and it'll show up on the other side of the coat, and then you'll just sew down your buttons. And here you have your finished coat. Here's the front view and the back view. Here we have all the pieces for the cape. We have the back, the fabric and the lining, and then the 2 front pieces, the fabric and the lining, and then we have our cape border, which we have cut out of velveteen, and then 2 ribbons that are going to sew into the front of the cape. To start, we're going to lay the pieces of the cape fabric right side up, and we're going to line up the shoulder seams. The shoulder seam is the curved seam. So on the front piece, the straight edge is the center front. So we'll take these pieces and then we'll lay them on top of each other right sides together. Line up this shoulder seam, pin it, and then straight stitch along both sides. After we have both shoulder seams straight stitched, you'll lay this flat on your ironing board and press this seam open. Now that we have the seams pressed open, we're going to turn the cape over, and then we're going to begin marking a 1/2 inch up from the entire bottom edge. So I'm just going to place my measuring tape on the edge. I'm at a 1/2 inch right here, and I'm just going to do little markings all the way around. Once I have the entire edge marked around on the cape, I'm going to take the cape border and straight stitch what we call stay stitching along the entire inside curve, just shy of a 1/4 inch, and that will help keep it at the correct shape to match up with the curve as I sew it on. After I have the stay stitching sewn, I'm going to go around the entire edge and clip into the seam allowance, being careful not to clip into the stitching line. So you'll do this around the whole inside edge of this piece. Now I'm going to mark center back on both the cape border and the cape. We're going to take the cape border with center back and turn it around so that the inside top edge is now facing down, and I'm going to set that on top of the cape and matching center backs, and I'll begin to pin this down. I'm just going to gently curve this out, and the slits that we cut into here allows this to curve in the opposite direction, lining it up with every little white dotted line that we've dashed around the edge of the cape. So you'll carefully just pin that down and work your way around, and the center fronts should line up. And then we'll pin around on the opposite direction. Once we have the entire cape border pinned to the cape, we're going to take this piece and run it through the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch just to the outside of this stitching line so that the stitching doesn't show through when the piece gets flipped over. Now that we have the border stitched down, we're going to take our scissors and trim this seam allowance even. So we're going to trim this down to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So the 1/2 inch that we marked is going to be trimmed off of the cape fabric. Now if you were going to use a lighter weight fabric like a lace as your cape border, then you wouldn't need to trim down this excess fabric from the cape. You'd want to leave it here so it has stability, and then the lace or the lighter weight fabric like a satin or a silk ribbon, it would just fold down this way, and you just press this down and then the edges would line up. But for this, because it's a wool and this is a velveteen, we're trimming this seam allowance out. Once you have the seam allowance trimmed down, you'll turn the piece over and then press the seam allowance open so that the border fabric is pressed up towards the border and the cape fabric is pressed back up towards the cape. Now we will take our 2 ribbon ties and we'll baste them at the top corner of center front. So you'll just set the edge of the ribbon here about 1/4 inch down so that when you sew your neck seam, the ribbon is not caught in that stitching. So once you have this pinned in place on both sides, you'll just baste over this edge to hold it in place. Then set this part of the cape aside. Here we have the cape lining. So this is right sides up, and we're going to do the same as we did with the cape. We're going to line up the shoulder seams with right sides together. So for one side, we're going to line this up, we'll pin it, and we'll sew a straight stitch along this whole edge. On the opposite side, we're going to line this up with right sides together. But then on this side, we're only going to sew about 1 inch down and about 1 inch up. So I'm just going to mark those edges with a pin. Like this, and then when I go sew, I'll sew down to this line and also up to this pin here so that this gap right here is left open. That way when we have the cape lining and the cape sewn together, we're going to turn it right side out through this opening. Here we have the lining shoulder seam sewn, and you can see that this portion is open. Now we're going to bring back over the cape, and I've wound up these ribbons and just pinned them into the center of the cape so that they don't get caught in any of the stitching. Then we're going to take the lining with the right side facing the right side of the cape, and we're going to lay them on top of each other. Then we'll just pin around the entire edge of the cape. Then continue to pin all the way around the edge until the entire piece is pinned. Then we're going to take this to the machine and straight stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the entire edge. After sewing the entire outside edge of the cape, you'll just carefully go around and notch the outside edge in a few places, which is just cutting a tiny triangle into the seam allowance, but being careful not to cut through the stitching line. So you just do that in a few places so that when the cape is turned right side out, it gives room for the seam allowance to fold in on top of itself. Then you're going to want to go ahead and trim the corners, just right along this corner and the stitching line, being careful not to cut through the stitching. And then on this interior neck curve, you're just going to cut slits into the seam allowance. Once you've clipped all the edges, turn the cape over and then carefully reach in and remove the pins that were holding the ribbon out of place. And then you're going to turn the cape right side out through this opening. So you'll just carefully push it out through the hole. And then once you have the whole cape pushed out, you'll have the right side and then the inside. So you'll notice that the corners are not pressed out well. So I'm just going to take my little tool here and go in through the opening and go right up into the corner, and I can carefully pull on the ribbon as well, very carefully, or it might pull out of the stitching. So here I've pushed this corner, and now you can see that that would be the top corner of the cape. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom front edge right here, just carefully pushing that seam out. So that right there is the center front of the cape. So then I'm just going to go in through this opening all the way over to the other side and do the same thing. After I have the second side with the corners pushed out, I'm going to take this over to my ironing board and carefully just press so that all the edges are flat. And then as you press, just make sure that you have the cape fabric pushed up a little bit higher than the lining so that the lining doesn't show from the front side. So you'll press it turned down slightly like that. Once you have the cape pressed flat, then just to finish it off, we need to sew this lining opening shut, and you just do that with your hand sewing needle. And here we have the finished cape, ready to be worn with the Ginza Girl coat. Be sure to share your pictures with us online using the hashtag LibertyJane. We'd love to see what you make.